so I don't forget. And again, closed captioning is enabled if anyone needs that. So I'm just going to go ahead and get us started so that we have plenty of time for our wonderful flash talk and our guest today. But welcome to the Penn State College of Medicine and CTSI's Now What? And All Things Research Collaborative, a virtual ECHO program for research staff and investigators. We are delighted to have you join us on this Friday morning. My name is Jessica Byler, and I'm a member of the ECHO team. And I'll be starting us off with our usual announcements that you may have memorized by now. But please put your name and email address in the chat for our record keeping. If you happen to be joining with someone else on the same Zoom square, please include their information as well for our attendance. Please stay muted unless you are speaking. You can, of course, always use the chat for communication or raise your hand. Again, closed captioning is enabled if you'd like to use it. Please remember, no identifiable information is allowed when discussing your study participants, maybe even colleagues as well. We are recording these sessions for educational and quality improvement purposes. We do have those recordings shared on the CTSI website, and I will share that link with you. So if anyone would like to revisit anything, you can take a peek there. And we will share all the materials after the session, including the slides and the resources. And lastly, in the spirit of all teach, all learn, we will be on a first name basis during our sessions. So today we have a flash talk on consenting challenges from Sarah Horn, followed by a discussion on consenting cognitively impaired peoples, and the teach back method from our guest, Hillary Lum from the University of Colorado. Thank you, Hillary, for joining us so very early your time. We appreciate you getting up for us. And as always, during the presentation and the case, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We can have our hub team try to help field those questions. And if you happen to have any answers to those questions, feel free to put those in the chat as well, because again, we're all here to learn from each other. So in the interest of time, we won't be doing introductions of all of our participants, but I will ask the hub team to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Erica.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Erica Van Dyke. I am a program manager in the Department of Medicine, and I'm also a Doctor of Public Health candidate here at Penn State College of Medicine. So hope you all enjoy the session, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Erica. Abby, would you like to say good morning?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name's Abby Fisher, and I am a project manager with two different teams. So one, I love to be part of our Project ECHO team, as well as the research navigator for the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, aka CTSI. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much, Abby. And LJ, who's usually here, is not available today. She's on service. And Steve, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Hicks. I'm a physician scientist in the Department of Pediatrics, and I'm the director of the Pediatric Research Resources Office.
Thanks so much, Steve. And Hillary is our special guest, and she is going to be doing our scenario later on, but I wanted to give Hillary the chance to say good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm from University of Colorado and a geriatrician.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And then last but not least, Sarah, if you would like to introduce yourself, and then you can go ahead and start your presentation if that's okay with you.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. And I'm Sarah Horn. I'm from the Human Research Protections Program here at Penn State. I'm the IRB director, which means that I oversee all of the individuals and committees who are performing IRB reviews. So I fall under that larger umbrella of our Human Research Protections Program. So expedited, exempt team, full board team, I do it all. And I will hop into my slides. So give me 1 second here. Okay. Is everybody seeing my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Good. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So these are some of the intro ECHO slides. So I apologize. I have no disclosures. My talk today is on informed consent. I want to make sure that I'm clear that in this particular presentation, we can't possibly cover everything around informed consent. There's so much to cover, right? I could talk for days. So we're really going to focus on those options for documenting informed consent, including e-consent. So we'll talk about signed consent, waivers of documentation, and waivers of consent or alterations of consent. And then lastly, talk a little bit about parent consent and child consent. I know Hillary is doing her talk on individuals who may not be capable of providing informed consent. And so I'm happy to participate in that discussion and answer any questions and kind of speak to Penn State's materials that we have around that. But I don't have a lot of that specifically in my presentation today. So just a little bit of a background about myself too. So I've been in Penn State's HRPP within our Office for Research Protections for about 15 years now. So I've been working in this field of human subjects protections for quite some time. Prior to that, I was working on several NIH-funded projects for a nonprofit research organization in Philadelphia, whose work was mainly focused on individuals in treatment for substance use disorders. And as part of that work, I did a lot of recruiting and consenting difficult to reach populations. So I have some experience with what you all do today in my past life. And so hopefully that'll come in handy as we talk today about some of our issues around informed consent. So a couple of ground rules for today's talk, just to set the stage, because again, there's so much that we could talk about. But today's talk is going to be focused on OHRP regulations, generally the 2018 common rules. So not, the historical past studies, even though those rules may still apply to research that's been ongoing for some time, with a few FDA points sprinkled throughout. So where it's applicable, I've kind of mentioned those things as well. We're going to be focused on expedited and full review studies, so not on exemptions. The requirements for exempt studies are different and minimal. So if anybody has any questions about that, I'm happy to answer it, but we'll focus on other forms of informed consent today. And then I'm going to provide an overview that is focused on main or important points. But as is our favorite saying in the IRB world, there are details and caveats that will, impact how you perform informed consent and what type of informed consent you use in your research. So it depends. And the best case scenario is to have the conversation with your IRB analyst as you prepare your project. If you have questions about what type of informed consent you may be able to use or whether your project meets particular criteria that I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to start off talking about the traditional signed consent. So you have two options for signed consent. One is the long form, which when you think about the traditional consent form, we're talking about the long form. And that at Penn State is called our HRP 580 template. I sprinkled those numbers throughout this presentation too, so that you can refer back to those. The second would be the short form process. So we have short forms available in 12 languages currently, and those can be used when you encounter a potential participant who speaks a different language other than English. You must be approved to actually use the short form process. I want to make clear that the short form process is not a substitute for translating documents in situations where the researcher anticipates enrollment of those who speak another language. The IRB doesn't have a specific cutoff of numbers, but I always say it kind of follows the rule of if it happens once, it's an accident, twice, it's a coincidence, 3 times, it's a pattern. So if you know that you're going to be enrolling individuals or going to a place that has a population that speaks a particular language, we will be looking for translated documents as submitted with the IRB protocol. We're also talking about here remote options. So it doesn't mean that this all has to be in person and using a paper form. You can use remote options using a paper form. For example, we have a telephone consent process that's outlined in our investigator manual. And that's something that study teams will often use, especially in situations where maybe they are obtaining consent for screening over the phone or something like that, but still need a signed document. So again, options of sending a copy by email or by mail or something like that are all possibilities still using that signed form. Okay. And I'm stalled out here for some reason, so give me a second. Okay. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about e-consent, so or electronic consent. So when we talk about e-consent here, what are we talking about? We're talking about the use of an electronic process and systems, which could be a computer, a tablet, a website, a smartphone, in order to convey study information to a participant and or document informed consent of a participant or their legally authorized representative. So here at Penn State REDCap is an available option for e-consent at this time. This option can only be used for non-FDA regulated research at the current time. That has to do with, it's a very long explanation to save you some time. It has to do with Part 11 compliance with the FDA and the fact that it's very expensive and time consuming to get certification for Part 11 compliance. And so we are currently in the works and talking with others about possible solutions moving forward for FDA regulated research. But in the meantime, our HRPP worked with CTSI and REDCap folks to determine an appropriate e-consent process using REDCap. There are some limitations on its use. For instance, with multiple signers and things like that, it does require some additional guidance from the REDCap team, but the CTSI can be consulted for more information and guidance on how to set up that e-consent process and what those possibilities are and what those caveats may be. For sponsored research, we do allow the use of sponsors platform for e-consent. So PIs have to provide sufficient information in our protocol if they want to use a sponsor's informed consent process for e-consent regarding the platform and documentation of that FDA Part 11 compliance when the research is FDA regulated. I think an important note to point out here is that if the study qualifies for a waiver of documentation of consent, which we're going to talk about next, e-consent, as we're referring to it here, is not necessary in that process. It wouldn't be required because we're not requiring documentation in those cases. So in those instances, the researcher may still have a process for having participants type their name into an informed consent form or something of that nature, but the signature requirement has been waived. And so any such action is not an official signature on the part of the participant. So just throwing that out there, because sometimes I think people think that they need that when they may not. And so again, that's about exploring those criteria to determine whether your study meets those criteria for a waiver of documentation. With e-consent, you still need a consent process, so it doesn't eliminate that need. You still have to worry about things like verifying the identity of the participant, providing an overview of the informed consent form as you would traditionally in a lot of scenarios, answering questions for the participant about the research and risks involved in the research. And you still obviously have to obtain the signatures of the participant and the person obtaining the consent, as well as providing a copy of the informed consent to the participant. And again, we have that process set up, and there's a way to do that through REDCap to provide that copy. Approval criteria for e-consent can be found in HRP 314, which is the document that outlines our approval criteria, Section 8. So there are some information, specific criteria relevant and information for e-consent in that area. So waiver of documentation of consent. So there are a couple of situations where a waiver of documentation is permissible. So oftentimes a waiver of documentation of consent is used in two different ways. The first could be implied consent. So this is often used in survey research, whether it be online or in person. The second is verbal consent. So this is often used for interviews and focus groups. It may specifically be used to obtain consent for screening procedures that are going to occur before the person actually comes to the lab or to the location for the first time, to consent for other procedures in the research. And often that's happening by phone. Doesn't have to be, but often it does. Appropriate documentation of verbal consent for participants is still necessary. So consenting notes, note to file around the informed consent process to document that those individuals have indeed provided effective informed consent. The HRP 580 is still applicable in these situations, but the 585 can be used for screening procedures specifically. So we really tried to narrow it down to what was needed for screening procedures in that 585 itself. If the study involves the use of PHI, HIPAA authorization is also needed. So the investigator would still have to justify that, essentially the waiver of the signature for the HIPAA authorization. So the options and criteria for waiver of documentation of consent are as follows. So the first would be the signature on the informed consent document is the only record linking the subject to the research, and the principal risk of harm to the subject would be a breach of confidentiality. So this is a situation that we rarely encounter, but we do from time to time. It's important to note that this must be the only link. So you can't hold a separate linking list or collect other identifying information if you want to use this category for a waiver. In addition, participants must be given the option to sign and their wishes have to govern. So it's essentially, if we're talking about research on sensitive topics like domestic violence or illegal activity, that's a situation where we might consider this criteria for a waiver and where the participant must be given the option to sign if they desire to do so, and their wishes would govern in that case. The second situation would be, and you see the ors between these because these are not criteria that all have to be met, right? These are different scenarios. So the second situation is when the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects and involves no procedures for which written consent is normally required outside of the research context. So this is something that we very commonly use. I mean, on a daily basis, we're reviewing many projects that involve this type of waiver of documentation. For example, we use this in situations where we have minimal risk research that involves surveys or interviews that are conducted online or via telephone. It could include a specific waiver like this for the screening portion of the study. Like I said before, that would use the 585 form before the consent for the main study procedures occurs. This criteria is also applicable to FDA research, so we can do that same thing. We can waive the documentation for that screening and then have a participant sign for the main consent for the study. The last and what was most recently added with the new rule is a criteria that is for minimal risk research where participants are members of a cultural group in which signing forms is not normal or acceptable practice. So in this case, they must have an appropriate mechanism for documenting informed consent. And this is most applicable to international research where signing is not the norm. So maybe they shake hands as a form of providing consent, or an elder provides informed consent for others in the troop, and that's done verbally or something of that nature. So that would depend on review of those local norms with people who have expertise in that area. The justification for the waiver of documentation has to be provided in the study protocol. So there's a section in the informed consent form where you would check that option and provide those justifications. So next we'll talk about waiver or alteration of informed consent. So this may be a complete waiver of informed consent entirely, or a waiver of certain elements of consent, which is referred to as an alteration. This is most applicable in scenarios like retrospective chart reviews, could be prospective as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or review of existing data sets, including for screening purposes. So if you have to review medical charts for screening, that could be a possibility. The alteration is often used in scenarios where the research involves deception. So maybe you can tell people a lot about what they are going to do in the study, but you have to withhold something about the purpose of the study. If the study involves the use of PHI, HIPAA waiver of authorization is also needed. So the criteria for HIPAA waiver can be found in HRP 441. And those criteria, again, are different than what we see for the actual OHRP criteria for a waiver of informed consent, or FDA criteria for a waiver of informed consent. So this may also, again, as I said, be used to waive informed consent in situations where you need to review records before participants are going to come to the lab or to your location. So the waiver of informed consent options. So waiver, the HRP 410 checklist outlines those criteria for a waiver or alteration of consent. This process includes these and several more criteria for other specific types of research activities that are not included here in this presentation because they're less commonly used at Penn State. Some of those criteria also apply to FDA regulated research as well. However, because the FDA has not harmonized with the 2018 common rule at this time, some of those criteria are a little bit different. So if you look at that particular checklist, it will walk through those different scenarios for FDA and non-FDA research. So to waive informed consent in total or to alter informed consent elements, the IRB has to determine the following things. So first, the research is no more than minimal risk to subjects. And again, this could be a portion of the research, like the screening. The research could not be carried out practicably without the waiver or alteration. Sorry, I can't get that word out today. This is one of the trickiest pieces and one that investigators have the most trouble with when providing a justification in the protocol. So it's something that we go back and forth with investigators about often. The justification is going to vary based on the study. So it really does depend, as we like to say. However, in general, I want to point out that it's not about the practicability of obtaining consent. It's about the practicability of carrying out the research without that waiver. So in essence, why can't the research be done if the informed consent has to be obtained? On rare occasion, prospective collection of data through intervention or interaction with participants may be granted a waiver of informed consent. But if the researcher is interacting or intervening with participants, they would really need to provide a justification as to why they couldn't conduct the research without the waiver. Inconvenience is not an appropriate justification. So sometimes we get that, like, we don't have enough staff. So staffing issues also not a justification for a waiver. But there are plenty of other things that we can talk through with you if you're considering a waiver for your study. The waiver, so the next criteria is the waiver alteration will not adversely affect the rights or welfare of subjects. And where appropriate, the subjects will be provided with additional information about their participation. So again, this is something that we commonly see in deception with debriefing, fully informing them of what the purpose of the study was afterwards. If the research involves identifiable private information or identifiable specimens, the research cannot be carried out practicably without using information in an identifiable form. And lastly, the alteration, I really can't get that word out today. I apologize. People are going to be watching this recording and thinking, what is she doing?
All good.
Alteration of the consent process can only omit or alter basic or additional elements of consent. So only certain things we can waive. So let's talk a little bit about parent consent and child assent, because I know that there are a lot of questions around this often. And again, the criteria for approval for parent consent and child assent can be found in HRP 416, our checklist for children's research. Note that here we're talking about, the age of majority in Pennsylvania. But if the research is occurring in other locations outside of Pennsylvania, that age of consent may differ, and that needs to be taken into account when planning for the research. So for parental consent for children under the age of 18 in the state of PA to participate in research determined to be minimal risk, one or both parents, as determined by the IRB, and we'll talk about that in a minute, must provide consent unless this requirement is otherwise waived. One parent is not an option for research involving minor increase over minimal risk with generalizable knowledge, so not direct benefit, but generalizable knowledge to be obtained. And for research that is not otherwise approvable. So it's this other category of research that doesn't fit these other criteria for minimal risk or direct benefit or those sort of things. So those are two areas. And again, that's outlined in section 5 of that checklist that I mentioned for children. So in terms of parental consent, a waiver of documentation could apply to parental consent. So again, consent, as long as it meets those waiver criteria, it could be done verbally or in some other manner that waives documentation. E-consent is a possibility as well. Again, that's a signed consent option. And a waiver of parental consent may be granted for certain categories of research with children, and it has to meet some of the specific criteria that are outlined in 416 section 6. It's rare for us to completely waive parental consent, but I've seen it done in situations where maybe the parental consent does not provide additional or protections to individuals who are in a particular situation or something of that nature. So maybe if the research was about something like child abuse or something, we would consider a waiver in those situations. But again, it would depend on specific details of the protocol. So HRP 13 is an SOP for legally authorized representatives, children, and guardians. And this document outlines who is a child, like the definition of a child under Pennsylvania state law, and also who can provide consent for a child to participate in research. Again, that varies from state to state. So if the research were happening somewhere else, that criteria may be different. And that's where legal counsel should be consulted about who can provide informed consent and who's considered to be a child in that particular location. In terms of child assent of a child, unless the IRB determines assent is not necessary, should be obtained. So in determining whether assent is necessary, the IRB will consider the age or capability of the child in providing informed consent, the nature of the research itself. So is there direct benefit in the research or not, et cetera. And a determining factor often documented on the signed consent form, but there could be a special, we often document this in the informed consent form with a special section for assent. However, a separate document may be warranted. So maybe a sponsor has a separate assent form that you'd like to use. We will also accept that sort of form separately. Generally, consent of those 7 years of age or older can be documented on that signature line. I know there was some discussion when I came in about those 7-year-olds and their capability of providing informed consent or signing the document, and we can talk more about that later if you'd like. So in summary, and I know this was all really quick, and again, there's so much we could talk about. There are different options for obtaining informed consent depending on whether the criteria that are outlined appropriately justified by the PI and are determined to be met by the IRB. The criteria for approval for waivers of informed consent and HIPAA authorization are different. So it's important to note that the PI has to provide justification for both as applicable to the research. The checklists that were referenced provide criteria for approval for those waivers and for parent consent and child assent. And we do have one for, individuals who are not capable of providing informed consent. And when in doubt, contact your IRB analyst. So sometimes you may be unsure about whether your research meets certain criteria. And that's where we can kind of have a discussion about how you would like to approach informed consent in your research and what the regulatory, criteria or implications are. And that's it. That's what I've got today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This is great. So if anyone has questions, I know we have a question from Steve in the chat. So we can get to that really quickly before we turn things over to Hillary. Erica, I know you responded to Steve, but Steve, do you want to just unmute and ask your question about the biospecimens?
Yeah, I personally do a lot of work with biospecimens
Sure.
and nucleic acids. And so we've never applied for a waiver of consent. We always get consent for our studies. But I was curious what constitutes a de-identifiable biospecimen, even if there's no label on the specimen, if you're going to be extracting something that could be used to kind of backdoor DNA, does that all of a sudden make it identifiable or not?
So Steve, would you be prospectively obtaining those samples from participants for the research, or are you getting samples from another repository or other location?
A little of both for various
Okay.
studies. So
Yeah. So if you were interacting or intervening, I would say that would be a hard, point to, a situation in which we would justify a waiver of informed consent. But if we were talking about existing specimens, we do have information on, whether something is human subjects or not. And that's kind of the criteria that we use for whether something is identifiable or not. And so we'd be looking to say, are there direct identifiers attached? Do you have a linking code list that you have access to as an investigator here at Penn State? Again, I know collaborations may be different because one place may have access to that and others don't. So there are some nuances to that, but generally we'd be looking for direct identifiers or some sort of link to identifiers.
great, thanks.
Sure.
You so much. So if anyone else has any questions, we're going to move on to the next part of the session, but if anyone has questions, we'll ask you to either type those in the chat or hold until the end. But I just wanted to thank Sarah so much. And the other point, not just asking your IRB analyst, and if you need help finding your IRB analyst, let us know. We can help you there. But is really the importance of planning ahead, because, you may, again, I know folks want to get their research done quickly. It's annoying to get consent, but it's really, really important. And so it's important to plan ahead, to talk to your IRB person about the regs around consenting. So thank you so much, Sarah. Again, as Jess mentioned in the chat, we're going to make these available to everyone as well. And I put a couple of other links and resources in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Erica Van Dyke, who is going to introduce her colleague and our guest presenter for the scenario today.
Great. Thanks, Abby. And thank you, Sarah, for that great flash talk. So I have the pleasure of introducing Hillary Lum, who I have had a great experience working with on some of LJ Vanscoy's work. So Hillary Lum is a geriatric and palliative medicine physician at the University of Colorado. Her research focuses on clinical trials to improve care for older adults and their care partners. She studies advanced care planning, dementia care, and caregiver support. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away, Hillary.
Thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to our discussion. And I am directed that this is the interactive part. So we want to discuss a scenario, and I'll ask the hub team to jump in to help facilitate interaction. We wanted to really focus on one aspect of informed consent. How do I know if this eligible patient has, or participant has capacity to consent to the study? So whatever their age, whatever their situation, you have this study that you are engaging them about, and then you realize, I'm not sure if they're fully understanding what's happening to be able to actually consent to the study. So next slide. And next click, please. And this could be in the context of having a known diagnosis of cognitive impairment, or I would encourage us to think more broadly. You may be seeking to do community-based studies or quite generalizable. And that may mean that you don't know fully what someone's background is. And so how do you determine if they have capacity to consent to the study? This is where I'd love, I think, or how do we like to generate discussion?
However you see fit, Hillary.
Okay, well, maybe like I've given a little bit of, go ahead and click 2 more. Thanks, this is the whole slide. So here at University of Colorado, we build in the teach back method. And I would be interested in any discussion of if anyone has had experience using the teach back method or a different method. So just sort of gauging, has anyone used this at all?
So I'm a bit of an outlier just because we have some prior experience, but I have some experience using the teach back method in obtaining consent.
Thanks. And any others? Thanks, Kylie. And then I guess we'll pause here. Would anyone want to raise a question of some discomfort or some challenge where you're in an interaction with a potential participant and you're not sure? And what does that uncertainty look like?
I'll
Be
chime
thinking
in
about,
here.
yeah, thanks, Kelsey.
Yeah, so I think if I had to use the teach back method, something I would be concerned about is we're developing these protocols. We know this research, and so we don't often think about it from a layperson perspective, and it's hard to be able to describe it that way. So I think I would be concerned about the questions that come up and, how to appropriately describe the study in a way that they understand. When I get it, I feel like I'm doing that, but it's not coming across clearly.
I really appreciate that. In actually incorporating in a teach back process, I think raises the level of our appropriateness in all consent procedures, like really helping us, again, as has been already emphasized from the very beginning, thinking about how are we designing our study and designing our materials involved in the consent process? How are we training ourselves? How are maybe we role playing to be, and then also practicing, perhaps piloting interactions in a comfortable way where we can, for ourselves as research team members, be realizing that discussing the study and being open to, okay, what questions do you have about this? Being able to answer those questions in a understandable way really pushes us. And so I do think that I appreciate, Kelsey, your acknowledgement that while I think that there is great benefit from a teach back process, and it helps with including individuals who can demonstrate capacity to consent, it can be a little scary and is something good to build into your team discussions as you're connecting about, well, how is recruitment going, and being able to debrief a bit. And thanks, really appreciate that a bit more is coming into the chat. So that's great. I'll have my colleagues sort of look at the chat, help me out with that, but let me go ahead and we'll show the slides again, and I'll sort of define our experience with teach back. And again, this is in the context where we've used this in a variety of studies. So I think you can use teach back anytime you are seeking verbal consent, so that waiver of documentation, or can be associated with written documentation. We don't want to just assume because someone's engaged in a written documentation process that because they wet signature signed it, that they understood, just wanted to just put that out there. These are 4 questions that are examples. These questions can vary, and I think you can certainly work with your IRB specialist to have them be modified for appropriateness. Within our IRB, we actually have 6 questions that are provided as examples. And so we then are, as a research team, we're encouraged to pick 4 and give our reason, our justification in our protocol for why we picked these 4, and then we train to them. Next slide. So I just wanted to give an example, sort of a very practical nuts and bolts of how this is incorporated into one of our manuals of operating procedures. So we also practically seek to provide a copy of the information sheet or the consent form ahead of time, knowing that more of our consent interactions are happening by phone or on Zoom. We do really try to ahead of time set someone up for success, whether that's by mail or confirming that they have it, sending it again by email. And then we'll read through the consent form and we ask the teach back questions. For us, we give individuals 3 attempts to answer each teach back question. And you can do this in a couple of different ways. Option 1 that we're describing here is you ask a question, the participant answers, even if they are not correct that first attempt, you continue with the 4 questions or number of questions that you're going to review. In that, individuals may have understood some aspects and be able to respond correctly to some of the questions. We also then have our REDCap form open and we're recording their answers, which then directs our team to return to that spot in the consent form, read it again, explain that part of the study again, and then ask that particular question again. And there really is, I think, a style that each research team member develops for themselves in terms of how they order the asking the question, hearing the answer, determining on the research team members' judgment, was that correct or was that incorrect? Was it correct enough? And then returning back to the consent form. So let's go to the next slide. I think this also takes some practice. Probably each of you have informally come up with what happens if someone isn't able to demonstrate capacity to consent. But I think it's important to practice this and even to script it out, because it can feel uncomfortable when you have some number of individuals that you've talked about with the study. They haven't been able to answer the questions correctly. And so you need to be able to say, based on your answers, we are not able to enroll you in the study at this time. Thank you so much for taking the time to go through this with me. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. And so that commitment to being positive and appreciative and supportive, even if there is a sense of disappointment, that can be on both parties' perspectives. And then, as sort of is true, maybe if, well, I'll just say in the context of neurodegenerative illness, when a person with cognitive impairment is not able to demonstrate capacity to consent, there may then be built-in seeking informed consent from a legally authorized representative. So like working out those transitions also is important. So those are the slides that I just wanted to walk through for us as a group. And now we can return back to the chat discussion. And maybe I'll call in Erica to sort of call out what would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So I think we answered Courtney's question about determining, if it isn't appropriate to enroll them and how to share the news with them of that. We had a comment from Anna that says, I have to teach back to adults with language impairments due to brain injury or stroke, and can be uncomfortable because you don't want to make them feel like a child or that you're patronizing them. But at the same time, we have to check for their understanding.
Yes, and I think that we use the teach back in really a lot of our studies, and so that normalization aspect I think is helpful, so that we're not choosing to use the teach back for some participants or based on certain triggers. We decide at the front end, if this is appropriate. So I think that normalization aspect is important, and then I think just naming what you're talking about there, Anna, as a research team and thinking about how to be person-centered, trying out some language, observing some responses over time, then bringing it back to the team to continue to workshop that so that we can have person-centered language. I think this is also a great call out for why having individuals with lived experience as part of the development of our processes is also really helpful, because they can be helping to inform our language, helping to have us be at the reading language we want to be, and even, you know, the tone and the words and the approach that we want to be at.
Great. And I have another question here from Stacy, and we can direct this towards both Hillary and Sarah, possibly. Have you ever experienced a time when you would have to get assent from someone while working with an adult who has been declared incompetent by a judge and now has a legal guardian in place?
Yeah, happy for Sarah to start.
Well, I personally have not, but thinking through this, you know, I think that would certainly take some coordination to ensure that you are aware of somebody's, you know, legal ability to consent for themselves. I imagine, depending on the setting that you're working in, that could be easier than others. However, you know, that technically that person, their legally authorized representative would have to actually sign for that individual.
Yeah, Abby, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I actually had a clarifying question for Sarah also. So I would imagine most people on the call know this, but we have a separate consent form for situations where there's a legally authorized representative involved. And but I've never actually had to use that. And so for Sarah, do you need to include that in your protocol? Is that
Correct.
accurate?
Yep.
And get approval to use the LAR?
Correct.
Consent.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That would be part of your protocol, and you would be approved to use individuals who have limited or no capacity to consent for themselves.
Sure. So that could be individuals with you know, developmental issues or cognitive issues, or older persons who may be in you know, example, in a nursing facility or something like that, where they have a person, you know, a power of attorney or something like that, that they can actually legally consent on their behalf. It's not just because, you know, some people may think that they want to be a part of it, but it's still, that's where it gets a little fuzzy. Like, you know, I bring my daughter, I'm older, I bring my daughter in and she thinks that she's in charge, but actually we need the consent of the person who is still competent to give their own consent. So that gets a little dicey, but when it's legally authorized, you need the approval of that before you start the consent process. Great, thank you.
I also think this speaks to the trickiness of, as a research team, how would you come to learn that a legally authorized, you know, that a legal guardian is involved? So I think that in some vulnerable populations, you might build in that as part of your HIPAA waiver, perhaps, that in being perhaps part of their medical record, at least this is how we would approach it, we would be looking to where it's stored in our medical record for legal guardian documentation, or depending on whether we thought that the number of patients who might have legal guardians was sufficiently high, we would also perhaps build in looking at most recent social work notes, or looking in spaces and thinking through where might we find this information in the medical record, and building that into part of our pre-screening process. And then I would acknowledge that we can be surprised, and just in chatting with someone realize, you know, because maybe the phone number goes actually to the legal guardian, and so we're surprised. And I could imagine that we, in that consideration, would want to describe the study to that legal guardian, ask them for the paperwork perhaps, and you know, that may be a situation where you haven't already added in the legal guardian form from your IRB. So perhaps it's like that one time that maybe you move forward, you don't have to fully stop things right there. And then you realize, oh, okay, we're gonna have an amendment because this is possible. It's happened once, so let's learn more about this. Certainly would also encourage all of us, as you know, in frontline situations, when you realize something that is different and new, just pause, say, thanks so much, really excited. Let me circle back. Can we make a time to call later this week? Need to check with my team, because it'll be a little bit complex. Other questions or comments here? Yeah, I like the comment you made, Abby, about discussing both within the team, but also colleagues with expertise in this area. So if you are involved in a new study, seeking to find the collaborators or co-investigators who have done this before, to ask them to perhaps share protocols. And that can be a great model to just have examples of scripting. Or also there are additional consent tools available, free, well-developed, that can help learn these new skills of using Teachback or navigating consent, assent, involvement of a dyad, consenting a dyad, which also adds complexity. I wanted to open it up and just ask if there are other questions related to this scenario or Sarah's presentation as well.
So Hillary, quick question. Do you have this built into all of your consenting practices for your IRB at the University of Colorado?
I can answer that two ways. So our IRB master form at University of Colorado has example Teachback questions there so that any investigative team can then opt to include them with appropriate rationale, but they are optional. They're not required. And I have them in our studies that are involving longitudinal interventions. I don't have them in our studies that are like, I have a study that surveys of caregivers of persons with dementia. So it's certainly possible that a care partner may have their own limitations in ability to consent. That is exempt, and I haven't integrated in Teachback for that telephone-based survey. So really, I think it's one of the considerations as we're considering sort of a number of aspects.
And I'll just address our IRB. That sounds awesome, Hillary, that your IRB does have those built into the IRB form. I kind of took note to see if that's something that we could consider moving forward. But we do have the section around the consent process. So we have separately documentation and process. And so that's where the investigator would describe what that process would be, including if you were using something like the Teachback method. Sometimes also people will use, depending on the scenario, like a quiz or something of that sort, depending on the population that they're working with.
And we have a question in the chat from Kylie. If you get consent from the LAR for an individual, but the participant does not provide assent, would you consider that participant consented?
This really is a nuanced and complex question that I think is sometimes a conversation that includes a data safety monitoring board and perhaps also conversations with the sponsor. So like in the context of some examples that I know of, depending on the study, that may be it may be that you need to have assent of the participant and consent from a legally authorized representative. On the other hand, in advanced dementia, as an example, we have advocated for even seeking assent could be a distressing situation. It could increase paranoia or other just behavioral manifestations of dementia. And so in that situation, we have tried to make it a little bit clearer where we have some input of like, would assent be distressing? And if so, then seeking permission to not try to seek assent, in which case then we would have participation based on the legally authorized representative's consent. But very tricky to navigate, and I think important to think through. And obviously that's where, these are often full board studies where, intervention is involved, and there's often involvement of the person who, for whatever reason, is not assenting, and we really need to be thoughtful and safe, protecting their rights.
I agree. And I'll just add on to what Hillary said, that the IRB, similar to the justifications for assent for children, the IRB is also looking to make a determination about whether assent is necessary for all subjects, for some subjects, or for none of the subjects. So if the answer is some of the subjects, we would then specify, like, if there were different levels of, capability or something of that nature, the IRB could say, okay, for these it's required, and for these individuals it would not be.
Yeah, I appreciate, Abby, your example of sort of in a systematic way building in a process for when teach back may be really helpful. I also think for all of our processes, I love the goal of having the interaction really be person-centered to maximize their ability to have opportunity to understand the purpose of the research and be able to participate. And I think that the teach back process actually sort of provides space, maybe slows down the process, provides space for individuals to demonstrate that they understand and therefore can participate. We have a historic practice, perhaps even current. If there's a diagnosis of something, well, then they're just automatically excluded. Or if they're above a certain age, they're automatically excluded. And I think that teach back provides opportunity for people to demonstrate that they can participate, regardless of what, a cognitive status might be. I also just wanted to acknowledge that for the research coordinator, judging whether someone answered the question correctly is actually nuanced. And so that's just a good thing to discuss as the team, and to even provide examples as you're starting to do your consent process, like how are people answering? That can be informative of where even might our information sheet or informed consent form need to be clearer. So we're really emphasizing the key points. We often have our consent form aligned with our questions quite well, trying to really be clear in what the study is about. I will pass it back.
I just wanted to say that's such a great point about making it person-centered, because as our population ages and this research is increasingly more important, and including all of the historically disenfranchised populations that have been excluded from or exploited in research, I think it's so important to facilitate it instead of trying to keep people out, trying to find ways to include people in the research. That's great. Thank you. Jess, do you want to wrap us up?
I will. Thank you all so much for your time, for putting together these wonderful presentations. Thank you, Hillary, for being here bright and early. Thank you so much, Sarah. And of course, to our wonderful hub team. You will be receiving an email that has a link to our session evaluations. We do take a look at those, especially for planning for our next series. And if you have any questions or problems, it does expire in 7 days. So we just wanted to let you know, and you can also use that certificate towards any credentials that you might have. We will see you again on May 17th, and our flash talk will be on EMR data. So I know that sounds very dry, but it's very important on how to get it, where to find it, what are the rules. So we're here for all of those things. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a fabulous weekend, and we appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, team. I'm gonna hop off unless anybody needs. Good.
I'm good. Great session.
Awesome. Thank you so much for bringing Hillary, Erica. That was
Oh,
awesome.
of course.
Yes, thank
She's
you.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I
Awesome.
thought that was great. I will
was-
send my notes out so you guys can take a look, but I won't send them out till Monday or Tuesday, so no rush.
Okay.
No,
Oh,
yeah.
all good.
Yeah.
All good.
Yeah.
Have a
Take
great
care.
weekend.
Enjoy your
Bye.
weekend. Bye.
Bye.